Sir Elwyn raises his hammer. The small dwarf man below him is badly beaten, but this opening allows Elwyn one final shot. The man who killed his family, hurt his friends, and stole from the tomb of his people will finally meet judgment for his crimes. Elwyn swings and rolls a 1. Missing is something that is pervasive, affects nearly all RPGs you could play. Yet you can see people get extremely frustrated with it in tabletop games rather than their electronic counterparts. When you look at the popular games on the market, you can see how most of them have options for the players to effectively build their character in a way that mitigates missing it entirely. Yet it's still kept in as a mechanic even when it can be largely invalidated. Why? Why not just remove missing? Well, this isn't a new thought process in the medium. It started to gain some traction with MCDM's Draw Steel, deciding it wanted to forego a null result. After learning more about this, I wanted to explore missing as a mechanic, why it feels bad, how games have removed it, and ways we can handle it in the games where it's still prevalent. By the end, I hope you'll come away with a better understanding of why missing exists in combat-focused RPGs, and how removing it can solve some problems, as well as lead to some issues. One of the reasons missing can feel so bad is the gap between intent and results. When you attack another creature in an RPG, you often want to hit, and there are a few counterplays to not hitting. Thus, when you're attempting to attack an enemy and it doesn't go through, it feels as though you've made a decision that ended up being negated due to circumstances outside of your control. Obviously, in a game about choices, it can feel terrible to begin having your choices invalidated by the math of the game or by the luck of the dice. That said, this sort of feeling is also the same as failing a skill roll with a skill you should be good at. These issues cause players to feel their investment in attacking or in that skill are being negated by the difficulty of the check or their own misfortune. Yet we aren't talking about removing failure states entirely from the game. Missing has its own category of feels bad because of the way it doesn't result in any interesting complication we now have to get around. We miss and nothing happens. The fight state may not have meaningfully changed from the previous round, and the players are feeling a little impotent as their little guy who is meant to save the world can't seem to find his way around a goblin. The situation of the encounter is now held in place while the next player goes. This can be especially hard in fights where the goal is to kill all the enemies. Every missed attack prolongs the fight just a little bit longer, even in the best of cases. You want to progress the fight, but because of luck or the dice, you feel as though your actions have had no consequences. Additionally, if you've built a particularly adept magic user, missing feels bad because you usually spend resources to attack. Spending something like a spell slot or any other kind of once per day ability on something that doesn't end up mattering in the grand scheme of the fight can feel quite bad. Not only have you built up your wizard to be powerful with their spells, but you've also invested a resource you won't be able to get back for some time, only to end up having it whiff and do nothing to the enemy. Humans generally don't like spending a lot of resources into something for it to not turn out. It makes sense then why someone would hate losing a spell slot to a bad roll or an ability the enemy has. This is why the spell save system works the way it does, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Something that doesn't get brought up as much is that a character's HP is also a resource that you do lose more and more of as the game goes on. Missing often gives your enemy an opportunity to attack you, and if you lose HP that way, you have still spent a resource on an activity that ultimately leads to few results. You might spend items, gold pieces, or simply time to your character's equipment and skills, but suddenly all of those decisions, all of that investment, is invalidated by the existence of the failure effect, leading to the enemy being able to strike back. Speaking of the enemy having a turn, another aspect that makes missing very frustrating is that, unlike video games, you're unable to act again with that character for another 20 minutes. You won't be given the opportunity to make up for a bad turn for a while. This can obviously be frustrating because people want to play the game and participate towards the group's success. Missing just feels like you're weighing everyone else down, and now combat is going to take longer for your team to resolve. This is why there's a lot of D&D combat advice on the internet regarding how players can take their turns faster. If you're taking too long to decide what you want to do, other people tend to get bored and start agonizing over every decision they made on their turn. To minimize this feeling, people often do their best to make their turn as snappy as possible. Even then, it might take some time before a player can go again. All this compounds on a turn-by-turn basis. You feel like the decisions you made didn't matter because you ended up missing, you wasted resources which didn't accomplish anything, and now you're stuck without any decisions to make for a while. It all compounds into feeling bad for taking up time with your turn. Given that missing can feel so bad, you wonder what designers have done to address it. Now, before we get into the business of removing missing entirely from the equation, let's talk about ways you might mitigate the feeling of missing. The most popular option is that using a resource still provides some effects, even on a miss. We're now ready to talk about saving throws and spells. Even if a creature succeeds on a saving throw, they still typically take half damage and sometimes mitigated effects. This makes it so using a resource still allows for some effect, rather than having that effect completely negated by chance. This is also the case for things like meta currency, where you attempt to control for luck by spending a resource like inspiration or a hero point. These meta currencies control for luck by making it simple to reroll at the cost of a currency you may not get back for some time. Another form of this is Lancer's reliable tag. Some pieces of equipment have this tag to have them still do some amount of damage even on a miss. The trade-off is you're not getting other weapons which typically provide other additional benefits. The system provides you a guarantee, but you're trading that guarantee for something that may have less utility or fewer options. Lancer also has another trick up its sleeve. It has an action system which allows you to do more on your turn. While this may seem like a small thing, having it so you can attack twice on your turn reduces the sting of a miss since you have the opportunity to do so much more on your turn. You can see this in a game like Pathfinder 2e, which has interesting decisions to make all the time. For example, I'm playing a champion and starting my turn next to an enemy. I start by demoralizing, which may fail, but is only done so I can have an easier time with my second action, which is going to be a strike. If that strike misses, I have some interesting decisions to still make on my turn. I could strike again at a penalty, move to a new position, raise my shield, or go for something debilitating like a disarm or a trip, although those would also be at a penalty. The important takeaway is that missing a single attack hasn't completely wasted my turn. I can still help my allies and I still have things to think about. Finally, let's talk about a way to have missing happen less, different dice systems. In D20 fantasy games, the dice has a lot of variance. This is because the D20 has an equal likelihood of landing on one of 20 potential sides. We can mitigate this variance by simply changing the dice system entirely. Instead of a single D20, we can instead roll with 2D10 or get a similar spread using 3D6. Due to the multiple dice rolling at the same time, they have significantly less variance and produce results which are more consistent. This can help us avoid missing from happening as frequently, since the luck is trending toward the average roll. We can then build defense values for our enemies around those averages, so the players are significantly more likely to succeed. Alright, now that we've talked about ways other RPGs mitigate missing, let's talk about removing it entirely from the game. We'll start by looking at existing games which have the players miss, and discuss the implications of removing the attack roll entirely. Starting with D&D 5e, and there are already huge issues with removing the concept of missing from the game. I want to first point out that missing is a much larger problem for martial characters, considering they don't have any guaranteed damage, unlike a spellcaster who can prepare spells that still do damage on a successful save. They get some miss mitigation at higher levels with abilities like extra attack, but it doesn't change that martials are struggling the most with having a turn where nothing happens. That said, if we were to remove missing for martials and instead mitigated their damage to its lowest possible value when rolling below an enemy's armor class, we would be fundamentally changing the way certain interactions are done in the game. Firstly, monster HP assumes the players will be missing the monster a certain percentage of the time. For D&D, that number is usually around 25%, but it's an important thing to consider as a monster's HP and AC control the pace of the fight. While we would like to think that D&D combat can move at any pace at all and still be satisfying, the truth of the matter is that monster math and player math are built to provide substantive experiences to some degree. If you're never missing, even if you're doing a little bit of damage, it can negatively affect the pace of your average D&D combat encounter. We expect a certain amount of gravitas from some enemies and a certain amount of disposability of others. When that's violated by the players and the enemies hitting all the time, it can make the game feel off. If we were to remove missing from 5e, we would probably want to up monster HP and in some cases lower monster damage to better reflect what the monster's role should be on the battlefield. This is doubly true for a game like Pathfinder 2e, which has a lower average hit chance and lower HP as a result. You would basically want to increase the HP of a monster dramatically or lower damage significantly so fights in the game still feel properly paced. Deciding what those numbers should look like and determining how much is right for the kind of game you want to run is a lot of work, which probably brings me closest to the conclusion here. If we try to remove missing from a game which assumes it happening at a baseline, it's going to be a ton of work, and it's going to be difficult to keep specifics in mind when in the middle of playing a game. It would be better to start from scratch and build or use a system where missing is no longer an option. When we talk about games where you don't miss, we're generally talking about games where rolling low on an attack roll still has an effect. This means you still want to roll high so you can get off some of your effects and hurt the bad guys. You can sort of think of it like a reverse spell save. For spells, the enemy still gets a little hurt on a successful save, but you typically get some extra damage or an extra effect if they happen to fail. Same thing here. This gradient of results is something that's currently being explored in MCDM's Draw Steel and Tom Bloom's Icon. When we look at these games, we can see some similarities in how they handle a combat system where no one can miss. When comparing, you'll often see a lack of saver sucks or abilities which have a severely debilitating effect on enemies. Usually, you'll see abilities do somewhat strong things to enemies, and they'll have a lower tier effect which does something somewhat weak to the enemy. You won't find anything like Baleful Polymorph or Slow being cast on enemies. Since the game wants to remove missing entirely, the game then has to raise the worst result up and bring the best result down. Doing only the former would lead to some pacing issues we discussed earlier. While some people may cheer about that, I can definitely see some players feeling like no ability really has the sting of some of the abilities they use in other RPGs like D&D and Pathfinder. You're giving up some of the excitement of stronger effects to remove a few feel-bad moments here or there. Another thing you have to look out for is how HP and resources are now handled. In games where you can miss, spending resources often gives a higher chance at affecting the battlefield. But in these games where the battlefield is affected nonetheless, you need to find a way to push the player to value their resources. Unfortunately, Icon and Draw Steel sidestep this issue. Icon's only resource you have to manage is HP. There are no spell slots. Draw Steel does have resources, but the game actually encourages you to get more by continuing the fight for as long as possible. These systems do work well for the kinds of games they're going for, but if we were to try to build a game where we wanted attrition to be an element, we would have to contend with what spending those resources would provide the player that standard abilities would not, which is also a ton of work. There are certainly other ways to provide bonuses to players, including a simple increase to accuracy, but those simple accuracy increases are going to feel a tad less powerful as a result of the change in what failing those attacks means. The final thing to consider is how vertical progression would be handled. For those not aware, vertical progression refers to numbers getting higher in RPGs. In D&D, your proficiency bonus increasing over the course of the campaign is a form of vertical progression. Typically, this allows players to become more reliable at certain tasks. However, if you're taking out the fail state on attacks, suddenly your reliability may not be as important. Icon handles this particular issue by simply removing vertical progression almost entirely. The game instead has players gain a wide array of options they can use at any given time. Having all those options available makes you stronger, rather than your existing options continuing to get better as you level up. Instead, it's more like a kit you build for your character. Contesting with all these changes can be hard work, but they are important to think about when designing a tactics game when you're expecting the player to never miss. One thing I would like to emphasize is that by removing missing, we're getting rid of aspects of the game people still like. People like receiving magic items that make them more accurate. People like managing resources like spell slots. People like having powerful failure results, and people like the way it feels like their character is becoming stronger through the game's numbers. Sure, we got rid of missing, but we've also gotten rid of a ton of other aspects people enjoy about the game. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but I think it's important to avoid declaring that missing is simply better design. It's not. It's different design. Since it may be difficult to change existing games, we're going to look for ways to help us feel better about missing in more popular titles and in our current campaigns. The simplest option here is to change how misses are presented to the players. Saying you miss to a player can feel a bit bad if that player is having a ton of bad luck. Instead, you might try contextualizing how the enemy is parrying or dodging a particular attack. Additionally, for heavily armored foes, emphasizing how their armor is protecting them from further attacks is an important way to communicate to the player that their character isn't wildly swinging at the air, but is connecting with a real problem they're still trying to solve. After all, two skilled fighters are going to be parrying and dodging each other's attacks, since they want to live. Describing two trained combatants slowly gaining an understanding of one another before a decisive blow is at the core of good combat writing. Describing an armor class in this way helps the players feel more like they're experts and less like they're throwing attacks out and hitting nothing but the air around their opponents. Additionally, having combat objectives other than defeating every single enemy on the map is a good way to have missing sting a little less. Having the players focus instead on securing a point, getting through to the other end of the map, or trying to grab certain items is a great way to make attacking a lot less important than good tactics and strategy. Using this, along with describing misses differently, can help players feel like missing isn't as devastating. Keep in mind, for all of these solutions, it's something for the GM to provide to their players. If you're a player, you'll have to take to heart different pieces of advice. Something that can get you in a real bad rut, and isn't helped by simplistic action systems, is that if you miss, you often have no other options to commit to on your turn. This can feel as though your turn has been wasted, which doesn't feel good. When you're playing these sorts of tactical combat games, it's very possible you're in a position to push some secondary objective on your turn. You're not as concerned about hitting the guy in front of you, but you want to stay next to him to get an opportunity attack, so your GM thinks twice about targeting the cleric. Considering your tactical options in this way will remove some of the bad feelings which can occur on a miss. Instead of just attacking, you're controlling space, limiting a route for the enemy, creating an opportunity for your ally, or taking advantage of an opportunity your ally gave you. While this isn't a cure-all, feeling like you have an idea of what your real goal is on this turn outside of attacking an enemy will help give some perspective on your true effects on a given fight, rather than being depressed at your bad dice luck. Keep in mind that even in 5e D&D, which has a deliberately simple action system, you have bonus actions and movement along with your main action on every turn. Make sure you're using those resources to get the most out of your individual turn by moving to an enemy's flank or using a bonus action option to open the enemy up to something an ally wants to do. These are powerful secondary actions on your turn that you can use even after using your main action, and can lead to you having an important effect on the battlefield. Having a few secondary objectives, or even just a backup plan, can lead to more meaningful turns without relying on the dice. My other piece of advice for players is to accept failure as part of the game. This includes missing. You'll often see D&D channels talk about how failure can lead to interesting storytelling, and how it may reinforce or change certain ideas of how a character should act. If your warlock struggles to read an arcane tome, that's more than a failure. That's a story of feeling like you're always left in the dark on what your powers mean and where they come from, being chosen in a way you don't understand or may never understand. Yet when we get to combat, everyone suddenly forgets all of that, and failure isn't part of a story, but merely a state we're in until the dice agree with us again. Realistically, this failure is like any other. It tells you how the story is developing, and learning to accept that is an important part of learning the game.
A professional has got to be able to do the job without taking it to heart.
It's also important to remember that your macro goal is to win your current fight using as few resources as possible. Your character missing a few times in a single combat will be unlikely to change the outcome of the fight, as well as the outcome of the adventure. You'll likely have good days and bad days, but the important thing is you're still being a contributing member to your team and being fun to play with. Don't worry about if this goblin ends up giving you a hard time. You've got wizards and clerics to deal with him if you're struggling to hit him for whatever reason. As you continue to learn about these games, accepting that failure is something that will happen to your character is an important part of having fun. If you can see your character get spiked by a trap they rolled low on and laugh, then you're getting better at being comfortable with the idea that not everything will go great for your character. There's a fun in that. A fun that you shouldn't deprive yourself of because you're so adverse to missing. My main goal with a video like this is to get people to think about their favorite games and how thoughtful the design can be in some of them. That said, one of the core principles of my game design philosophy is that, more often than not, it is full of trade-offs rather than simple victories or failures. We've looked at how missing can make players feel bad, how systems mitigate that feeling through built-in mechanics, and how other systems handle not having any missing at all. You do lose something when you remove missing. Variance in effects has to be reduced, damage numbers have to be tighter, resource management needs to be more considered, and you need to find other methods of progression. That said, we are doing this for a good reason. Having a turn go to waste feels terrible, and missing can often be frustrating as we feel we have no control over how the dice decide to roll. There are ways to mitigate that feeling while still keeping the design, but it's ultimately not enough for some players. For some of them, they're willing to take that trade-off and accept a game with lower variance for the feeling they are always doing something on their turn. For some players, they feel that missing adds a certain spice to encounters and helps with their idea of how the game's world should work. These are both valid experiences, and an important part of being part of the hobby is allowing yourself to try out both and see if you like one or the other. Or maybe you like narrative games or something. Hey y'all, I just want to take a few seconds of your time to shout out my Patreon. The best way you can support me is by sending money through Patreon or Ko-Fi. If you're not able to monetarily support, that's not a problem. The next best thing is sharing the video with people you think would like it. One last thing, I do stream here on Tuesday and Thursday nights, usually around 6 p.m. Pacific. I usually play video games, but I'm always happy to chat about the videos I've made and TTRPG stuff in general. Thanks again for listening and for your support.